Good morning. Welcome to the workshop on scope detection of peer review articles at the Pan-Asia Conference. My name is Steinn Sigurdsson. I'm the scientific director of arXiv, the preprint, ePrint distribution and storage for sciences, physical sciences, mathematical sciences, and computer sciences in particular. I know a lot of you are familiar with arXiv, and I was asked to give an overview of the current status of arXiv and the future plans, tentative future plans that arXiv has as an organization, and in particular, how some of our plans relate to knowledge discovery in open science. So just a reminder, these are preprints. These are actual genuine on-paper preprints. They're in my office. They're still there because they're hard to find. These are papers that are of use to me for my research, and some of whom are still not widely available online. So I got the paper copies before they were published. In some cases, these papers were never published. They were technical reports or other proceedings of nature which did not end up in journals. And they were mailed through mail service on paper to selected research groups and institutions, and then you'd fight for them. They'd arrive at the library or the reading room, and people would scramble to get the latest preprints, and you'd wait in line to have them handed down to you by your betters. As a graduate students, we used to sit in the hallways when preprints came in and wait for a professor to literally toss the preprint out. And you'd scramble to try to get it on occasion if it's a particularly new and hot result. This is not a very efficient way of distributing knowledge, but it provided for more rapid knowledge discovery than waiting 6 months or a year or two for the paper to come out in a journal. And it had a lot of other side effects, including establishing precedents. You marked the time of your thoughts with a preprint and claimed a priority in some cases on discoveries or new ideas. And you circulated knowledge fast. These are journals. This is a shelf at the back of our library, and we still have a few physical journals there, although by now, of course, most journals are online, including the back log of old journals. These particular journals are the Physical Review from the American Physical Society, American Institute of Physics, technically, and David Mermin, a scientist at Cornell, famously noted that if you extrapolated the rate of growth of journals, the physical shelf space required to house them, the Physical Review in particular, would in the very near future be expanding faster than the speed of light. But David also noted that this was okay because they would not violate the theory of relativity, because no information would actually be transmitted. So almost 30 years ago, there was an email distribution list where Joanna Cohen, and then at Princeton, would receive from authors every week the latest emails in the field, emails of tech and PostScript of the latest results in the field. And she would forward it to a mail distribution list. This was interesting. It was leveraged by the combination of email being generically available in the academic community over the so-called internet, and by the ability of authors to typeset their own papers in tech. LaTeX was not yet there, and to send and distribute and print papers yourself through PostScript. So this confluence of technological developments in the late 80s and early 90s enabled the electronic sharing, efficient electronic sharing of preprints. The problem was John was overwhelmed. There was a lot of people wanting this, both to send in their papers and to receive them. And at a conversation at the Aspen Center for Physics, it was suggested that it should be automated. And Paul Ginspark, at the time at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, actually that afternoon wrote a script to automate the process and took over the email distribution list, and it became a thing. It rapidly grew into more areas, including more areas in high energy physics and then astrophysics. And then it spread to other subjects, mathematics, computer science, other areas of physics. And now we include quantitative finance, electrical engineering, economics, statistics, and are hoping to go further. There are additionally a number of spin-offs or similar services paying homage to arXiv, many of which use the Kive name. Most prominent is bioRxiv and more recently medRxiv, but there are a number of others which are not part of arXiv. They're independent services that set up with various degrees of success. Some of them are very successful, some of them have fizzled, and some of them are sort of stumbling along, but it's definitely a thing. A lot of you may not know, arXiv about 20 years ago relocated from Los Alamos to Cornell University. And a year ago, an impeccably timed move in March 2020, arXiv actually moved to Cornell Tech, a new campus of Cornell in New York City. We have very nice offices there in the new buildings on the Cornell Tech campus. And we've still not been there a year later. The campus is closed to, and basically everybody's working from home still. We hope to be there soon. The arXiv now comes under the Vice Provost and Dean of Cornell Tech, Professor Greg Morissette. And concurrent to the move, we hired a new executive director to run the arXiv, Dr. Eleonora Persani. arXiv is a very small operation. We have 12 staff, some of whom are part-time, and we rely on approximately 200 volunteer moderators to do a lot of the day-to-day work involved in keeping arXiv what it is. The moderators cover the subject and categories of subjects that are within arXiv scope. There's approximately 150 categories across 8 subject areas. There's a subject advisory committee for each subject area, which supervises the scope and the standards for arXiv. And then there's an oversight board, the science advisory board, and a separate member advisory board of about a dozen people, which consults on operations and gives recommendations on policies, etc. The funding is in part from Cornell. Cornell in particular provides a lot of in lieu services, including offices and overhead operations. We get significant member funding, a couple of hundred member institutions, in particular academic institutions and university library consortia, each provide a modest amount of funding to arXiv, which adds up to about half our operating budget. And this is matched by a very generous donation from the Simons Foundation. And in addition, we get a number of smaller specific donations, often related to particular initiatives or tasks, both from other foundations and also individual donations. Typically once or twice a year, we do a very low-key request for donation and get a very nice contribution, usually from our authors and readers. For a subset of them, there's no requirement to donate. And there's actually somewhere we have a little donate button hidden on our website if people are feeling inspired and have some spare Bitcoins or something. Okay, this is everything you need to know about arXiv. If you're not familiar with the XKCD, go and browse. It is the best science cartoon in the universe, particularly since they had a very nice recent cartoon about arXiv. This really tells it all. And if you want to go a step beyond, click through to the comic and roll over and get the hidden text that tells you everything else. But this really is arXiv. we accept people's papers when they write them or later. We put them on the internet and we host them for free. There's no cost to put your paper on arXiv if you're the submitting author. And they're there for anybody to read. And they're discoverable. We provide search functions and us to a lot of third parties. And we do this all the time. It's fast. We've been doing it for almost 30 years. Our 30th anniversary is this summer. And it just happened. Scientists just went out and did this, and it works. And interestingly enough, the publication industry kept chugging along. The high energy physics is certainly, there's still a number of commercial journals and society journals in high energy physics doing their thing. And the journals provide an additional level of service that is not provided by arXiv, notably refereeing of papers. So the principle of arXiv, the reason we do what we do and our function at some level is to provide you with the latest research fast. We get most of the papers out within 24 hours, except over weekends. Our staff gets a break over the weekends. If you submit a paper before 2 o'clock in the afternoon, New York time, it will, in most cases, be available for people to read at midnight Greenwich Mean Time that night. A lot of people receive a distribution announcement by email. You can pick your silo, you can pick which categories you're interested in, subscribe to email or an RSS feed telling you what new papers there are in your area, in your field. And it'll be there for you in time to glance through in the evening or check in the morning, depending on what time zone you're in. And of course, all of it also pops up on the web. It is large enough an operation, it actually takes time between us starting to send stuff out and it being distributed. It's not an instantaneous operation. It actually takes tens of minutes to do the distribution, which occasionally leads to very panicked authors wondering where their paper's gone. We emphasize a clean and simple interface. One of our claims to fame that we're very proud of is that we did not fall into the temptation of using Flash or frames or any other transient fad in user interfaces. Partly this is because we are providing worldwide service to people with heterogeneous internet access. And we don't want to provide data-intensive user interfaces just for a look and feel. You find what you want, it's text-based, and you can save your data for the downloads. We also put a cap on individual file size for papers, which was recently raised, simply because we don't want to gratuitously be sending down gigabytes of data to people without warning. If you have ancillary files or very data-intensive stuff, you can actually include them up to a point with arXiv's ancillary files, or link to a data repository where you store such data. arXiv is for technical papers and people working in scientific research. And our predominant mode of production of papers is through tech, or more generally LaTeX now. We provide the service both for the authors, people who want to write stuff and get it out to people who may be interested in it. And we provide a service for the readers, people who want to find research and read about it fast, all of it. There's some tension between those services, and we try to balance the competing needs of the authors and the readers and maintain some compromise. We require the source of materials. We will not circulate image files or encrypted files or basically source files that we cannot scan. Formally, we require a source file for the papers that are machine language readable and human readable. They also need to be printable, although that is increasingly an obsolete function. Originally, there was TeX and PostScript, and now it's more generally LaTeX and PDF. And if your paper is generated through LaTeX, we want the LaTeX source, and that is for archival purposes. We need to have, to the extent possible, the source for the paper, so that whatever technology we're using decades from now, the paper can be regenerated from the source if needed. Papers are issued with a stable arXiv identifier, arXiv : number code. These are actually unique and versioned and constitute a digital object identifier, although they're not in a DOI format because they were established before the DOI was established. arXiv predates a lot of things. It actually predates the web. It was initially an email and then FTP service, but adopted to www when it came along. Although famously arXiv for a long time used the XXX prefix rather than www, because it went on the internet before there was a convention for www as a default identifier. This caused some confusion in the 90s. Papers on arXiv are discovered, and we know this in part because there have been a number of studies that show that all things being equal, papers that are distributed on arXiv during the pre-publication phase, or in some cases submitted after they've been published in journals, which is permissible for a number of journals and conference proceedings, but not all of them. They get a significantly higher citation rate than papers that are not on arXiv in the same subject areas, all things being equal. And it's not clear where the cause and effect is on this, but it is definitely a thing. There's a lot of data and a lot of data analysis on arXiv processing. This is our number of submissions per month as a function of time. As of the end of April, we are at 1.8 million plus submissions, papers that have been sent to us in the last 30 years that we've distributed. Our record month was March this year, almost 18,000 papers in a single month. It's a little bit of a fall off in April, but I expect by June we'll again be peaking. And as I said, we cover a range of areas of science and are hoping to expand that. Given resources and opportunity, we would like to expand into other adjacent areas of research to those we currently cover. I just checked, and it's still April. We're pre-recording this just in case. And there are already submissions for this workshop and PAKDD in general on the arXiv, and I expect there will be many more by mid-May. arXiv has about arXiv has handed out about 2 billion downloads in the last couple of decades. Those are individual article downloads through Cornell. We have historically run a number of mirrors. We used to have several mirrors spread across different continents to balance downloads. This level of traffic used to be a large data problem. Currently arXiv hovers just about at the level where if you have a top-end smartphone and you compress it a bit, you could fit all of arXiv onto your phone, which is impressive in many ways. This also does not count bulk downloads. We've historically provided bulk downloads through a separate export service and through Amazon S3. And there's also now a possibility to download the arXiv corpus through Kaggle, which I will talk about a little bit later. Download rates are going at about 4 to 8 million per week. There are a factor of 2 variations in download, sometimes for obvious reasons and sometimes mystifying. So we're talking roughly 10 downloads per second. That's enough web traffic that it's a significant load on the university servers, and we're moving this mostly to the cloud. Google Cloud is the service we're currently settled on, and are transferring our corpus to the Google Cloud. We are receiving papers at a pace of over 150,000 new papers per year. And I think we'll be at 200,000 soon, maybe not this year, but next year. That's 200,000 new research articles per year. Approximately a quarter of those are in computer science, and computer science is currently the most rapidly growing subject in arXiv, and will become dominant in the near future. Physics and mathematics are close to being saturated in the sense that in many areas of physics, mathematics, and astronomy, we are already getting essentially all the research output in arXiv. Computer science still has some way to go, but we are currently covering a large fraction of all output in computer science and heading for essentially most of it being sent through arXiv. This is the downloads per month plot. It's noisier and getting unambiguous individual downloads is tricky since we do some filtering on robot and bulk downloads to avoid skewing the data to spurious download spikes. This is the overview of arXiv across all fields. On the left, you can see the different subject areas, and you can see the growth in computer science and how it's taking up a significant fraction now of the total number of papers being submitted. This is from 2019. Yes, this is through 2019. And on the right is the fractional number of papers per subject area as a function of time. You can see as new fields enter the arXiv, they push down the fractional contribution of other fields, even though all the fields are growing. And right now, computer science is the most rapidly growing field and is taking up a significant fraction of all traffic on arXiv. This is an overview of the computer science categories. We have quite a large number of different categories in computer science. And a number of those have been added over time. You can see the fractional growth on the figure on the right. And currently, computer vision and machine learning are the most rapidly growing categories, which is not surprising. And the growth rate is very high and is causing some management problems in terms of handling that amount of traffic. Now, the arXiv is not the internet. There is an internet out there. You can put almost anything you want on the internet, and it'll sit there, it'll be indexed, you can tag it for archival, and it'll be preserved in perpetuity, and it's discoverable. The arXiv is not the internet. The arXiv is very much a subset of the internet. It is intended for a narrow particular use using the internet. And a lot of people don't realize this, but arXiv is moderated. The content is curated. We're actually formally defined under New York state law as a private curated collection. We have stuff, but we don't take in just whatever. Our moderation is by design light touch. We are not refereeing papers. We are primarily checking for scope and substantiveness. So when you send a paper into arXiv, is it a paper? Literally, is it in the form of a conventional research paper in some very broad subject defined sense? And is it on the subject you sent it to? If you're sending a paper to group theory in mathematics, it should probably not be on social interaction in computer science, unless you've found a particularly amazing way of using group theory, or more likely making a breakthrough in the theory of groups through that way, which happens and is important, but is not the typical use case. It has to be substantive. And that is also a not terribly well-defined term, but it cannot be a too low a level. Undergraduate homework problems are not suitable for arXiv. Unquantifiable speculation is generally not on topic for arXiv unless it's very subject specific, and no, it is not an absolute barrier. We don't do book reviews. We don't generally do policy papers, although, for example, we entertain white papers. We entertain papers, white papers are papers that are typically in response to a formal agency or government request for input on directions of research or state of research. Those are generally considered to be of interest to researchers, and therefore they go in the arXiv. One criterion for whether something is in scope and substantive for arXiv is it something an active researcher at the PhD level or above would be interested in seeing? And we decide if it is of interest. Somebody has to do it, and that is part of arXiv's job, is to determine scope and substantiveness. You also have to be a registered user of arXiv in order to submit an article. This is needed for several reasons. One is we want to know who you are. If you want to put a paper on arXiv, you have to own it. It is yours. You put your name on it. Everybody will know it's your paper. We generally don't entertain pseudonymous submissions. You also have to show that you can assign a copyright to the paper. Let me be careful here. arXiv does not take copyright. We distribute papers under either the arXiv license or a variation of Creative Commons licenses. We do not hold the copyright. When you send a paper to arXiv, you retain the copyright, but you have to have it to begin with. If you don't have the copyright, if you don't own the copyright to the paper, you cannot give us permission to distribute it. And this is why we need to know who you are and how to get a hold of you. We do not generally expose user data, and we comply with appropriate regulation on user privacy, but we need to know who you are, and we need to know how to get in touch with you. You generally means institutional affiliation or an address you can be contacted in, and an email address. The service we provide at that point is we distribute the paper. We provide an identifier, a stable, searchable identifier. We index it. Part of the categorization is we provide indexing of the paper, and we arXiv it. arXiv is an arXiv. Once you put a paper on it, it's there in perpetuity and discoverable by others, except in very, very narrow use cases where, for legal reasons, the paper is withdrawn completely. You can withdraw a paper in the sense that you can put up a note saying, oopsies, this is a mistake, or I shouldn't have done this, but we will leave a record showing people that the paper was there and you did this. So if you take down a paper on arXiv because you didn't want it there, people will still be able to see that it was there, and in many cases be able to retrieve the text of the paper and see what it was you did. So caveat emptor when you put a paper on arXiv. Our standards are in principle intended to be uniform or homogeneous across the categories. In practice, there is some variation in academic standards by categories. My particular stance on this is, for example, that mathematicians seem to be very fond of every paper having some sort of a proof and lemma and stuff like that in their papers, and good for them. In my field, there's very little need in general for there to be a proof in the paper, but we want to see data and results. And we adjust standards for papers and their suitability in arXiv to the academic standards of the field that they're submitted in. As a sort of philosophical principle, and I am currently the scientific director of arXiv, so I have some say in this matter. One of the standards we have is there are two aspects to a paper. One is it correct? Did you do it right? We don't actually check that in general. If you want to make if you make a mistake, that's fine. There are a number of great papers that had mistakes in them, sometimes very serious mistakes, but they were still interesting papers that led to more research and in some cases triggered entire new research directions. So we want things to be correct, but they don't have to be right. A criterion you could consider is they should not be not even wrong. They should not be so off that the typical reader is going kind of, huh, what is this? This does not relate to what the subject of the paper is. When the things are just so off that is like, no, this is not on topic for the research. The other axis is then, is it an interesting paper? Now, duplicating research is necessary, and null results are necessary as a way of research progressing. But you don't want to reinvent the wheel all the time. You don't want to be, we don't want to be flooded by a large number of essentially trivial papers that don't add anything new. Again, this is not a strict standard. You can have a paper that's very correct, but not terribly interesting. You can have a paper that's very interesting, but not actually correct. In some areas of physics, that is most of the papers, arguably. But some combination of the description of the research being done, being interesting, and being in some sense advancing our knowledge or providing a correct prescription of something, is some linear combination of that. It takes you over the threshold for arXiv going, yep, we'll put this out there in case somebody's interested in it. And it is a fairly generous standard. The problem moderation, and we have to do moderation very rapidly because we require the papers in general to come out within 24 hours if possible. And a large fraction of papers do come out essentially the same day, is it doesn't scale. In particular, a moderation essentially is a friends of friends network. That's how it grew. And it is both arguably not well connected enough. It's not a dense enough a network. And you can have holes in it. You can just not have connections in some directions where you should be covering things. And we worry about this a lot and work on it, recruiting moderators, trying to make sure we cover areas where we're missing expertise, but it's a hard, labor-intensive task. So we also do automation. In particular, we use and have for a number of years been doing machine learning and natural language processing and essentially soft AI scans of the corpus of arXiv. And that is part of the reason we require papers to be machine readable or plain text. In particular, we have a classifier that helps and that guides the categorization of papers. We actually have three classifiers. One runs synchronously in the submission process, it was written by the Papers with Code people and generously provided to arXiv. And it checks the metadata and the abstract, title, abstract, authors, and associated metadata, and does a fast classification using that data. It checks whether the submission is in scope in general, what category is appropriate, and gives a weighted recommendations of categories, and whether it is an arXiv type submission. We also have two asynchronous classifiers, one of which has been running for a number of years and is provides input after submission, and then a under development classifier that does a broader check and is more is being kind of still trained. At different levels, we get input from those classifiers for most papers. Given the growth in arXiv, we need to make this process more efficient. We need to automate the flow, and we need, in particular, to keep the scope check, the understanding what subpart of physics, what category and what subject does this paper belong to, and where should it be crossed to. A major function of arXiv is that we permit cross-listing. We don't silo papers. A lot of papers are essentially a single topic paper. They have a silo, they fit in there, they have their readership, and that's great. But a lot of the interesting things happen when you cross research between disciplines, when you do cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary research, where you impact other areas of research. A trivial example of that is statistics in general and machine learning in particular, where a new technique has very high impact across a number of categories. And you want to inform those other categories that there are these new results, that they may be of interest to you, and how do you find them? So we cross things. We send papers in one category to other categories as a cross-listing. A fraction of papers is held. By hold, we mean we don't release them to the queue for release that night. We take a look at them. Most of the holds are for technical reasons, bad metadata, tech errors, stuff that is usually quickly fixed by the author if the author is reading their email. Some fraction of holds is over categorizations, and that often requires a multi-hour or sometimes a few day discussion between moderators about, does this belong in your category? Do you want this? Or somebody interjecting saying, no, this should be in my category, and taking it. Those holds are mostly cleared quickly, although occasionally we get log jams and the holds get prolonged, and then we have an additional process to try to clear the long-term holds. That then becomes subject to workload on volunteer people who are having to come in and in some cases do a detailed and looped iterative process for settling the issue. We have further considerations, in particular, the one that came up with a flood of papers on COVID-19, which is normative issues. There are papers that are not abstract research. They may have clinical implications or policy implications, and those require a somewhat different standard of research. And with COVID in particular, we got a small grant from Google to do more intensive screening of COVID papers very early on in the epidemic. And we have a part-time PhD that scans the flood of COVID papers and takes a close look at the ones that are tagged either by the system or the moderators for further checks. And the COVID papers have longer average holds and a higher fraction of holds, so we check on these things. This is partly to conform to the standard in biomedical fields, or meet them halfway, and partly because it's just the right thing to do given the situation and some of the not even wrong papers that came out in the rush to try to understand COVID. We felt there was need for some filtering there. One thing we don't want to do is become gatekeepers. And this is somewhat contradictory, because when you curate, you are closing the gates on some things. But we are not limited to academic researchers. We are targeted at academic researchers, but we welcome submissions from anybody, as long as they're doing academic level research and it's interesting. You have to get in the door, but the door is open. We don't want to miss the next Ramanujan. We know there are people out there. There are high school students, there are undergraduates, there are amateurs, retirees who are doing interesting stuff and finding things out, and we want to get that out there. It's not our average use case, but they're there and they're important. There are papers that are only on arXiv. Some very famous prize-winning papers exist only on arXiv because the authors felt there was no need to publish them. They're out there already. People have discovered them. What is the need for a journal? And that may become more frequent in the future as people get used to arXiv's function in different subject areas. So that is part of our mission. By the way, if you're a high school student, one of the main problems with your submitting your papers to us, if you actually have made an interesting discovery, and it does happen, is you have to be of legal age or have a co-author of legal age to give us permission to distribute your paper. That is a legal issue involving whether you have the right to sign a contract, essentially, or not. Okay, we want the arXiv to be interesting. This is the role of classification and scope judgments. That means we deal with a lot of edge cases, and we need to make decisions on them. When you are on the edge, it often becomes a 50-50 call. What do you do? Is it in? Is it out? Is it over here? Is it over there? You also have to understand that arXiv, as with everything, is subject to Sturgeon's law. Sturgeon's law is that 85% of everything is crap. Most scientific papers are, most scientifics are okay, but not every paper is a great paper. And we want to have signal to noise ratio greater than 1 within arXiv. We want to be providing information. So we need to accept the fact that there are a lot of papers that are average. But we also have to cut them off somewhere. At some point, we have to say, okay, this is just not substantive enough to be included. I personally have been arguing heuristically that our category choices essentially trigger Arrow's theorem. There is no, in some cases, there exist cases in which there is no choice of categories or order of categories, which will make everybody happy. But we have to make a decision anyway. So we categorize things, and sometimes people are not happy about it, but it's better than not. So what's going on with the arXiv right now? Well, we are our code base is 30 years old. We are in the process, and have now been for 3 years, in refactoring our code base, which we are doing in situ. The current code name is Phoenix Archive, and we're hoping to do a partial public beta release this summer that will be functional and people can play with, but is not going to replace arXiv in its entirety. It's Dockerized Python as a primary model for coding, and we're lifting arXiv up to the cloud also, and are partway through that. We've been working on streamlining the submission interface, cleaning it up, providing better feedback to the authors, and closing the loop on some submission issues. And behind the scenes, we're working on our moderation tools, partly to keep up the flood. We need to be more efficient in moderation and provide software support for our moderators, and partly so we can expand and do more in moderation. We are working on APIs, and we have APIs for accessing arXiv and picking up metadata and actual text of the print papers, of course. And we will be modernizing and expanding those. And we are also going to a goal of being all open source. And last I checked, we were about 1/3 of our code base is open source and is on GitHub. There's also a private GitHub for the part of the code that is not open source. Okay, we are working with a number of partners. We have long-standing partners, so the Astrophysical Data System and INSPIRE, the high energy physics database. Look those up, by the way, if you're not familiar with them. They do some interesting things that would be nice to see in other fields. We have formal partnerships with Semantic Scholar and Google Scholar on some aspects of discovery and other database issues. We also have a formal partnership with Papers with Code, which is now part of Facebook, Core in Europe, and most recently Kaggle. The arXiv corpus is now on Kaggle, available for, in particular, intended as a research set for natural language processing things, and there are Kaggle challenges issued for the arXiv corpus. This started, actually COVID triggered this. the COVID research papers were being provided expeditiously through various processes, and Kaggle wanted them. And we were talking to them about this, and it's like, well, why don't you just take all the papers? The data set is there for research. You cannot redistribute it. If you're using the Kaggle data set, you can do it. You can do your natural language processing experiments or run your code on it and do research on the corpus of the arXiv. But if you want to point to content within the arXiv, it has to go back to the arXiv, because we only have license to distribute things from arXiv. If you want to tackle the PDF source or a paper in arXiv, it can't point back to Kaggle or a private repository where you're holding a copy of it. It has to point all the way back to arXiv where it is stored. We are looking at expanding other options and doing more functionality with arXiv as a data set, and also arXiv as something to explore. And we have a formal process for doing that now through arXiv Labs. This is arXiv Labs. It is sort of been there for a while, but it's only recently been formally set up. And if you want to discuss a partnership with us, we have a process for that, different levels of partnership, and we regularly check requests for partnership and consider them and whether they are within scope or within our capabilities. We are also working on the broader issue of arXiv fitting into the general ecosystem of distribution of research. We've been working on the DOI issue, and we have actually, we are going to be issuing DOIs in a DOI format. It's basically arXiv ID converted into a DOI, and backdating DOIs for our entire corpus, just to keep everybody happy, and so you can use DOI tools on the arXiv. This is going to be done through a DataSite. We are working with the European Research Council on Plan S compliance for European Union sponsored research for open access. And we are looking into other national and supranational open access requirements to see if we are compliant or can become compliant within our resources and policies, including, of course, US standards, since arXiv is formally hosted within the US. We also try to comply with other community standards as we can, and as they are consistent to our policies, our parent institute policies, and the resources to implement them. If you set a standard that we cannot implement with our resources, then we cannot do it. More long term, LaTeX and PDF are great if you are the kind of person who loves LaTeX. But what comes next? These are not things that are going to be there forever, and we need to know what is coming in the authoring world. And we can't jump on fads. We need archival and stable tools that provide archivally stable source and support the technical requirements of the author community, which in our case means you better be able to typeset and produce gorgeous, readable, and machine-readable equations. LaTeX set a very high standard there, and we don't want to fall back from that. We are working on integrating code with submissions. Papers to code, obviously. We would like to accommodate some things like Jupyter's and Colab notebooks. They need to be stable, and we need to be able to do so. We need to have the capacity to index and store them and search them. And there's actually already a capability for providing curated URLs or ancillary information files with arXiv submissions. They're underutilized, and we'd like to formalize that and expand that capacity, probably with partnership with third parties. This has already been discussed. I should also note that we are working on providing a permanent dark archive for the arXiv, just in case we go down, which at this point means all Google Cloud going down. We have copies of arXiv scattered around, but we'd like it to be a formal system for preserving arXiv in perpetuity through some dark and deep archives, and that is happening. On a more general basis, we would like to expand our content type. We would like to provide custom content delivery services by type, by more metadata functioning than just a category. And we'd like to provide a personalized and smart discoveries to find the unknown unknowns, to find the research you don't know you need. That is currently pending as updating our database schema. We need to have a better database system for providing some of these tools, and that is actively being done. We are also hoping to do subject area expansion. With arXiv moving, we had to put expansion of arXiv on hold for 3 years now, and we are hoping to start expanding our categories and our subject areas again, modulo us having the resources to do so. There's a growing trend towards overlay journals, where journals essentially use arXiv as a repository and provide indexing and refereeing, but don't actually store or produce the papers themselves. This is interesting. It is generally done without discussion with us, which means we become a critical path service for third parties, and that has to be resolved at some point. And there's a significant demand for various comment and discussion services, and we would like to accommodate that, but currently the discussion is that this will be accommodated outside arXiv and not as part of the core function. And it needs to be done in a way where it does not become a unpleasant or counterproductive. And as most of you, I'm sure, know, general comment services are either extremely labor intensive and expensive to curate, or become unusable very quickly. And we don't want to avoid that. To do any of this, of course, we need more money and we need more people. That's always a problem. We are a very slim service. We have a very small staff. We have a very small budget given our scope. And to do more, we are going to have to get more capacity. And that is where we are.